guys, to what is it? It's lecture 5 of the 7 deadly sins. This week it's anger. We had a lovely seminar earlier on pride, on John Cassian and Hildegard of Bingen. Thank you. There'll be another seminar on Thursday on sources related to anger. So anger is the sin we're looking at today. In Latin, ira, sometimes called wrath. It's a difficult one. Now, it's actually not the second in the hierarchy of sins, the second most deadly, at least for Dante and for most other thinkers, Gregory the Great. It's usually third. We're approaching it, I suppose, to make more distinction between pride and envy, but also you'll see why in our second lecture. It links well with the lecture on the Crusades that I want to give you a little bit later. Anger is a difficult sin to approach. The problem, of course, with anger, a couple of things. Is it okay for an emotion or a passion to be sinful? It's something that people feel. So with other sins, we can say more clear-cut, well, this is a breaking of a moral code, but anger can reasonably put down to a force within the body much more easily than envy or some of the other sins, avarice. You'll see gluttony and lust have the same problem. Connected to some feeling within the body. The other problem, obviously, with anger, maybe you think about it yourselves. I hope none of you get angry in your daily lives. There's obviously a difference between being irritated, hating something in a sort of superficial way, and then being angry about something. And I wonder how many of you have felt that terrible anger, that terrible, terrible anger that I think we're going to encounter today, the kind of anger that people describe as eating people up from the inside. Now, maybe if you have had those experiences, maybe like Aristotle or like St. Thomas Aquinas, you might come to a similar conclusion, that there's more than one kind of terrible anger that might be seen as wrong or sinful, that eats you from the inside. Aristotle says there are 3 kinds of anger, right? The first one he calls, or at least St. Thomas calls it, choleric. Choleric, this kind of quick irascibility. Ooh, someone shuts your finger in the door. Why did you do that? But it goes quickly, right? That's the point of that kind. And I'm sure we all experience this from some time to another. Sometimes it's much, much worse, isn't it? I'm just so furious with the way things went. And then I take a deep breath and maybe it's gone. This is choleric for Aristotle. The second kind is what he calls bitter. And I'm sure this one explains itself. This kind of anger is the stuff that you keep inside, and it's more long-term. It has a duration to it. Someone did something to you. All right, so let's keep with the someone shut your fingers in the door. I'll never forget how he shut my fingers in that door. It's that, you won't let go. On a more serious note, this can be feuds, My family will never forgive the Frangipani family for what they did in Rome in the 1120s. This is the kind of bitter anger that can stay with you. As you'll see, maybe in one of our readings, Dante shows this kind of bitter anger as people's souls being submerged in the smoke, submerged in thick black smoke. It clouds their judgment, it consumes them. Choleric anger, it's been and gone in 1 second. And then there's the third kind of anger, and this is the one that I definitely hope that none of us will ever experience or have. And this one, Aristotle simply calls difficult, difficult anger. Quite simply, this is the stuff which is mal-directed, anger which comes not out of a kind of reaction to something that's happened to you. I won't forgive this family, I won't forgive you shutting my fingers in the door. This is more anger generated out of other hard feelings. I'm jealous of your success. I don't like it that you're so successful, and I feel angry about it. This is difficult anger, and this often leads to violence against others. And for Dante, this is the anger that's in hell. This is not punished in the 5th circle, the lovely, easy 5th circle, where it's just a little bit, it's still terrible. It's in the 12th circle. Violence against others, much, much worse. Now, the problem, maybe you've thought it yourself, the problem with anger, of course, is it really that bad? Is it really that bad? Now, with pride, it was easier to make a case that, well, it can be the root of all other sins. If pride is estimating your own abilities beyond what is reasonable, or if pride is believing you don't need others, by those definitions of the pathology of pride, it's pretty clear-cut, right? It's bad all the way down. if you accept those definitions of the pathology. With anger, and I have one example here, this rage, this bitterness, this unhappiness, it's harder to make that seem like clear-cut, always sinful, isn't it? What about this kind of anger? Like, this is a protester, actually about climate change. I want you to panic. I'm angry. This person is angry, okay, about what's happening with the climate disaster, the climate crisis. And that anger surely is an example of a kind of anger which we could see as being socially constructive, as being productive, as being useful for some reason, as being righteous. Now, whether or not you agree with her, if we were medieval theologians, we could also say, well, this is still sinful anger for these reasons. And you'll see there are some who condemn anger outright. But it's something to bear in mind, framing our discussion. When is anger useful, and how do we pathologize this kind of anger, the kind of anger that seems to be nothing but of the purest intentions? Okay, so there are 4 things we're going to do in this lecture today. 4 questions, if you like. We're going to begin with this big question, the biggest question in studying anger in the Middle Ages, and probably today. Should good souls get angry? Should good people get mad? And if so, when and how? And as you'll see, there are some pretty strong voices on both sides. Pretty strong voices who say, on the one hand, you should never be angry, you should never lose self-control, because to get angry is to slip out of rationality, it's to lose control. For some writers, this is surrendering to the animal, surrendering to the less than human. You might not accept, by the way, the binary between human and animal like this, good, bad, and so on. But for some writers, right, it's never good, it's always a loss of control. For other writers, conversely, right, anger, if you don't feel anger, it's a problem. If you don't feel anger, there's something wrong with you. Maybe this is a bit like that protester. If you're not angry about the climate crisis, what the hell's wrong with you? Might be her response. So we'll look at that question. This will be the gorier part, the revenge, how far is too far. We'll look at revenge and this idea that there can be a justified, vengeful action, something righteous, good revenge, and then we'll look at when it goes too far. And there's going to be a particularly nasty example from Shakespeare. It's very nasty indeed. Then we will look at anger management, modern therapy, and biological science. As every week, I hope, we'll take a time to just reflect on what are the modes, the lenses through which we view anger right now. If you have an anger problem, well, already calling it a problem, you're seeing it through a lens. But let's say you had an anger problem and you saw a specialist right now, what would they tell you? What kinds of things and tactics would you discuss? How would you situate that as a problem? Of course, the Middle Ages would have a totally different answer, but we should look at biological sciences, neuroscience, and things like that. And then finally, we will finish with a look at anger in the history of the emotions. This is a subfield of history that's been developing over the last 20 or 25 years, which wants to historicize the emotions. And there's a big debate, of course. Do we feel emotions the same way people did in the Middle Ages? Is our anger the same stuff? Is it the same neurochemical processes that frame your angry experiences now? Betrayal feels the same 1,000 years apart? Or how can we historicize that? Do emotions change? How can we measure it? Okay, so that's what we're going to do. So let's start with that first big question. Should good souls get angry? I'm sure every single one of you has a view on this question. Maybe most of you think the answer is yes. Okay, should good souls get angry? If you have a strong feeling about this, okay, just be aware that there are strong feelings on the other side, and you might be convinced one way or another. Basically, if we want to make this a Christian issue, from the very start, we should confront this enormous paradox. This enormous paradox. Is the microphone now working, Marianne?
I don't have an answer to that question, but I think it's really important for us to establish the concepts. Like, who are good souls? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm.
Okay. I think this is a very good point. Who are the good souls? I mean, yes, we know that this is an enormous value judgment, good souls. We're dealing with medieval texts where the answer to this question is pretty clear-cut a lot of the time. There are good souls and bad souls. How do we know? Because we get descriptions and depictions of the Last Judgment where some are on Christ's left side and some are on his right side. There are the saved and the damned. So unfortunately, in medieval theology, popular thought, popular culture, this question is much simpler. Yes, in the 21st century, I wouldn't even know how to begin to dismantle this question. I'd say it's ludicrous. What do you mean, good soul? You know, I would say, well, we might say there's no soul for a start. I wouldn't necessarily say that, but yes, good and bad are obviously always relative. We always must know on what terms are we describing this as good or bad. And of course, this is in many ways the point of the course is to expose the constructed nature of those categories. But in medieval Christianity, right, there's already a paradox the minute you start to think about this question. On the one hand, we have clear-cut from Job, and it's describing God's anger, but it extends out to the anger of the human. By the breath of God they perish, and by the blast of his anger they come to an end. God gets angry himself in the Old Testament. We ourselves are permitted a certain kind of vengeful anger. God himself takes vengeance on all numbers of people in the Old Testament. People are, you know, you might think of the Sodomites, for example, Sodom and Gomorrah, God's vengeance and wrath. But remember, in the Old Testament proverb, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, vengeance and being angry at people who've done something to you to upset you in a really serious way is licensed. In the New Testament, however, we get a much different picture. Matthew 5:22. This is like the place to go to think about this issue. And these are the words of Jesus. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, rakat, this is like a little insult, is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Oh, goodness. It's pretty, if you think about it, on the one hand, you can be angry and vengeful. On the other hand, in the Old Testament, on the New Testament vision, it's not just that you can't be vengeful, you can't even be angry. Even saying, oh, you fool to someone, is already a problem. There are two towering thinkers in this debate, one of them Christian and one of them not, who I think provide the two firm pillars that we can navigate our discussion around: Seneca the Younger and Lactantius. You might have come across at least one of these figures. Seneca is, of course, a Stoic philosopher. He's a Roman Stoic, same tradition as Marcus Aurelius. And, you know, you might, if you've heard of the Stoics or you've come across them, you know that they have some views of human nature and how adversity should be suffered. For the Stoics, and we use the word in English, Stoic is to dig in and put up with things and to be unchanged, not to be easily risen to temper or to, our emotions. And Lactantius, however, is a Christian apologist. He's one of those early influential writers of the church. He's around about the same time as the Emperor Constantine. He's one of these people who builds Christianity as a religion of the text. So you probably know which way this is going to go. Let's go. And Seneca writes his treatise, De Ira, on anger, around about 45, the year 45 in the CE. And for Seneca, it is really hard line. All anger is wrong. All anger is wrong on his moral terms for these reasons. And I'm just going to pick out a couple of them to show you as quotations. First of all, he says anger is not natural. This is the problem. He says it is not natural for the human. The human is born for mutual assistance. See how, and now you're alert to this thing about how morals are constructed. Mankind is born for mutual assistance. Anger is born for mutual ruin. The former loves society, the human. The latter, anger, loves estrangement, tearing people apart. The one loves to do good, the other to do harm. The one to help even strangers, the other to attack even its dearest friends. Now you see the problem with this, don't you? The problem is that word natural. So for Seneca, it's natural. It's part of nature. It's nature's order for the human to live in a society, to love it, to do good, and to help even strangers. This is wonderful. So any of you who well, or if you come across the theory that society that basically we're all competitive, nasty creatures, this idea that we all really secretly hate each other, it's actually much more popular in the 20th, 21st centuries. This vision of humanity, like the crooked timbers of humanity, that civilization holds us together, laws and codes hold us together, because by nature we would actually be competing. Sort of a Darwinian notion of the survival of the fittest. We really want to outdo each other. That's not Seneca's view of society at all. For Seneca, it is natural to coexist, to be generous to one another, to live in a society. And obviously, there's a problem with that definition of nature, or at least it's debatable. But then it also is against reason. Reason herself, who holds the reins, is only strong while she remains apart from the passions. So for Seneca, another contentious point of view, your life should be guided by reason entirely, and reason is divorced from the passions or the emotions. So that is to say, a good life lived according to nature, as a good human, for Seneca, your passion should not be involved. Now, this means your anger should not be there, of course, but there are implications for other emotions. So your compassion, should that not be involved? Is that not an emotion? Your joy, your desire for, I don't know, your love. These things should all stay out of it for Seneca. Seneca actually goes as far as to call anger, I think he calls it the worst plague that the human race has ever known. So it's a long treatise, well, fairly long, but it just makes the point over and over again. All anger is unacceptable by these reasons. Unacceptable, against reason, against nature. Lactantius responds, and he's responding directly in a dialogue, 250 years later, in a dialogue with Seneca. And he's upset with Seneca, he's upset with the Epicureans. He's allowed to be angry, of course, because he believes it's okay for the human. Lactantius makes this big claim, and note the title of this is On the Anger of God. On the anger of God. Makes a big claim. Not only was God angry in the Old Testament, but it's okay, and it's a model for us as humans. We should learn to be angry too. It has a benefit. So for Lactantius, he who loves, therefore, must hate, and he who hates, therefore, must love. This is the point he makes, and it's a strikingly original one at this time. It just makes the point that the emotions themselves are interdependent. You cannot, in other words, he asked the question, is God kind? And he says, well, yes, if we look at Scripture and we think about it logically, of course God is kind. And he says, well, if you're kind, by necessity you must also be angry. He says it's impossible to be moved in one emotion and not the other. That which is not feared is held in contempt, and that which is held in contempt cannot be worshipped. You see the argument goes both ways. Not only are the emotions interdependent, so if you're going to be kind, you have to also be angry. And he makes that claim through an ingenious use of logic. Because he says, well, okay, let's entertain the idea that God is kind but not angry. And logically, he argues that it just does not make sense, because kindness itself is predicated on recognizing someone needs kindness, recognizing some injury. If you recognize an injury and you're not angry about it, then it shows that you're not responding to it. That which is not feared is held in contempt, and that which is held in contempt cannot be worshipped. This is another arguably contentious claim. That if you don't get angry about things, then you're not feared. So arguably, like, you can imagine a professor. If I'm always, it's fine, your assignment was late, this is okay. Oh, it's okay, you didn't need to turn up. If I just keep doing that over and over and over and over and over again, why do you bother? Most of you will still turn up and still do the assignments, but for some of you, you will hold me in minor contempt. This would be the argument. You think, it doesn't really matter if I don't do his assignments. But he says, look, God should not be contempt. If he's held in contempt, he cannot be worshipped. So, from Lactantius, God must be angry. But note, right, that this amounts to a theory of all the emotions. This can be applied, and Lactantius wants to apply it to all the emotions. He wants to apply it to you as humans, us as humans, which is to say, if we want to be kind, we must also accept anger. Anger has a virtue. It responds to injustice. And you might remember these kinds of images, because the question is, how are these put into practice? And in many ways, we're going to trace this throughout the rest of the lecture, these kind of two poles. But if we look at something like Prudentius's psychomachia, again, it's from the 5th century, it's a poem. It's described as this war between different aspects of the soul. They're all personified. So ira and patientia are both women in this because they're both feminine nouns in Latin. And as you can see, this is depicted here, and I think we talked about it before, but the sword of anger breaking on patience. Patience is actually, in this poem, described in an extremely stoic way. The virtue of patience seems to be a bit like, I don't get angry, I don't invest my emotions in anything, I just let everything wash over me. It's like Seneca's view of what the human should be. And here's the poem, it's pretty melodramatic. Patience remains quiet, bravely withstanding every shower of weapons. Unperturbed by the javelin of the monster fuming with rage, the monster of anger, she calmly waits for wrath, or ira, or anger, to consume herself from within. Soon the savage warrior had exhausted all her strength by anger. Her arrows lay broken. Her broken sword now seems like a token of her shameful passion. And madness now drives her to self-destruction. Loads of things to notice there. Of course, you see there, calmly waiting for anger to consume itself from within. Remember, this is kind of a model of what should be happening in your own mind, your own soul. The psychomachia is like the battle that takes place within your own mind. You as a Christian, as the audience is. So this is what's supposed to happen for you. You're supposed to be like, you feel the anger and you think, let the anger go, let it consume itself. Or if you encounter an angry person, you're angry at me because I did something, I shut your finger in the door. Yes, I'm supposed to say, no, just let the anger go. It's all right. The anger is self-defeating. It's patience that will win. Bit of a selfish example, isn't it? Wrath consumes itself from within. Other things to notice, wrath exhausts its own energy. It's this phrase here, shameful passion. It's that phrase which is so problematic. It's so shameful, is it? Shame. To feel shame about something. It's not just guilt, shame. It involves the conscience. It involves reflection. You should be ashamed of your anger. That's the vision that's coming here. And I think you'll agree, it's a pretty stoic sort of vision, maybe. But then we have this problem, because this is not the only way that anger is framed. It's not like the Stoic view that patience should trump all anger dominates medieval thought. There's obviously the other side, something much more like Lactantius, which holds sway. And this is what we're going to explore in our second lecture, the Crusades. And we confront the basic paradox that you have an entire series of religious wars where the whole motivation for these conflicts was stoked up, if we believe the accounts, was stoked up from the very beginning of, guys, aren't you angry that Jerusalem has fallen? Aren't you angry what the Saracens are doing to the Christians in the East? That is exactly the hook that popes and other very prominent religious thinkers use to begin this series of religious wars. So that's a problem we'll save for the second lecture. But now I want to move on to the question of revenge. This is a problematic one, isn't it? Is revenge, does it ever feel good? This is actually, well, that's the whole point, right? If we just look at Aristotle, of course, classical thinker, writing obviously before Christianity. As you know, Aristotle's ideas become extremely influential, especially from the 12th and 13th centuries onwards for medieval writers. But Aristotle, it's that pleasure element of revenge that he emphasizes. Vengeful anger for Aristotle, there are two things. It must always be felt towards some particular individual. I suppose that could be extrapolated for a collective. But there's a difference, right? It's a difference from saying, I hate something, for Aristotle. Oh my God, I just hate coffee baristas. I don't, of course. But, that wouldn't be the same. That's not anger in Aristotle's definition. It's some particular something. I hate that barista. Again, I don't hate any baristas. But, that's the anger. It's got a particularity to it, and that's important. The detail is important in anger and revenge. The detail is important. It's not generalized. I hate the world. That's not the kind of anger that these writers are interested in. That's more like mania or something. It must always be felt towards some particular individual. But then there's also pleasure. It must always be attended by a certain pleasure, that which arises from the expectation of revenge. And this is problematic, and I think it's best explained right at the start of Western literature. Almost the first words written in Western literature pertain to anger. From Homer, from the Iliad, and he describes anger like this, or revenge, vengeful anger. It is far sweeter than slow dripping honey, clouding the hearts of men like smoke. This paradox which Dante picks up in the Purgatorio, where the angry souls they're clouded with hot, dark smoke. That's how they're punished, for 1,000 years of nothing but smoke. The smoke that they try to throw at others, the blinding smoke they're then forced to feel in their human form. So this is the paradox of revenge, right? It feels so good, and yet it also intoxicates. It's that kind of thing. The discussion of revenge often has that tinge to it, like the discussion of lust, or the discussion of gluttony, or the discussion of other kinds of temptation. It's something which is sweet at first, but then intoxicates you, leads you to go way too far. If you're slightly falling asleep, now's a good time to fall asleep, because this is a horrible example of revenge, but it's a really, really memorable example of when it goes too far. I'm sure you're aware of, it's quite dark, isn't it? I'm sure you're aware of the genre of revenge tragedies from the 16th and 17th centuries. Revenge tragedies become really popular. So it's just after the medieval period. This idea that one individual often goes on a quest to seek ultimate vengeance on his enemy or her enemy. And they're tragedies because often this vengeance eats the person up inside. They're fantastic plays for exploring the limits of this. Hamlet is where the genre really goes beyond itself and questions itself, because of course Hamlet wants to take revenge. His uncle has murdered his father, but he can't do it. He almost knows, he's aware that it's destructive. He can't bring himself to take vengeance. So that's a great commentary on this genre. But let's look at Shakespeare's earlier play, the disgusting Titus Andronicus. Why is it disgusting? Well, most Shakespeare critics say this is his worst play. They go so far to say he didn't even write it. It was partly written with George Peele, I think is his name. Whatever. It's an early play. It's the most full-blown revenge drama there is. Like, think of the most disgusting kind of revenge scenario. It's definitely in there. This is the film version from 1999 with Anthony Hopkins playing Titus Andronicus, a Roman emperor. The basic story... Oh, this is way too dark to see. Maybe that's good. The basic story is that Titus himself is betrayed. He's betrayed by a woman called Tamora, who he brings into his family. Tamora and her sons engineer it that first of all, they rape his daughter, Lavinia, and cut off her tongue, and they cut off her hands so she can't explain what happened. That's sin number one. Sin number two, they kidnap his two sons, and they say, we'll give you your two sons back if you cut your own left hand off. Titus cuts off his own left hand, and instead of giving the sons back, they give the two heads of the sons that they've decapitated. And then they engineer it that they're going to bring him down even further. Titus eventually captures them. You see this scene, hark villains from the play. In the film, they're hanging, the two villains who've done all this terrible stuff, hanging from the ceiling. And it's a horrible monologue. The revenge that Titus then takes, this is the moment in the human drama of, my God, you've gone too far. Is it possible to go too far for avenging a daughter's rape, the killing of two sons, and the chopping of your own hand off? It's an interesting question, isn't it? Well, we started with the question, well, justified anger is right. Is there a justifiable anger in this scenario? It's almost like showing how the intoxication, and what Titus does, and it's so disgusting, it involves these pies, and it involves a banquet where he invites those two men's mother to eat the pies. And I think it's obvious what happens. Isn't it disgusting? The end of the play is everybody ends up dead, basically. Now, for Shakespeare, of course, it's a very crude examination of the limits of vengeance. Hamlet is so much better for exploring, Is it right? Is it wrong? Vengeance would feel sweet, but it would also intoxicate you. That's why Hamlet says, dares not to do it. He knows it's wrong to kill his uncle, to become worse than what he is, just from outrage. Titus doesn't know that, and of course ends up destroying himself. In the Middle Ages, yes, well, we need boxing horses to cheer ourselves up after that. What we have in medieval drama is we have the same kinds of discussion sometimes. When is it going too far? We don't get that same level, I don't think, unfortunately, of psychological complexity. We don't have a Titus figure who we watch monstrously lurching over the line of acceptable. We don't have a Hamlet figure who exposes the very stupidity and complexity of pushing on with the vengeance plot. We actually just have sometimes just big celebrations of vengeance fury and sometimes massive moralizations. The story of Raoul de Cambrai is one. This is a chanson de geste. This is one of those epic stories. They're kind of forerunners to novels in the West, usually written in the vernacular in France, French vernacular. Raoul de Cambrai is just one of these heroes, who is heroic despite doing terrible things. Like he burns down a town at one point, killing all the people in it. But hooray for Raoul, what a knight. Because it was justifiable vengeance. God was on his side. Raoul replied, "Their deaths are not enough. I'll slay you too." This is a big fight that Raoul has with Erno, a rival knight. "Their deaths are not enough. I'll slay you too, if but the chance should come." Erno replied, "My blade shall drink your blood. I challenge you by good St. Nicholas. The right is ours, so help me God above." It's this weird paradoxical situation where they're both claiming that God's on their side. They're both saying that, God wants me to win this one. And they're both also boasting about how much blood there will be. Just how excessive will the vengeance be? Reading these kinds of texts is very difficult to get a sense of where the line is. Where does the vengeance go beyond what's acceptable? Where does it go beyond the line? And if you read any of those texts for yourselves, you can make a judgment. In this case, it's so unclear. I was expecting to see Raoul condemned in the text for just wanting so much filthy bloodshed, but really what I see by the end of it is this is a mark of his heroism. His desire for vengeance, his anger, his righteous anger against an enemy is completely justifiable within the code of chivalry. For a more rich and developed psychological exploration of when is revenge too far, art sometimes from this period provides a more interesting case study. So I want to look at this woman here. This is a painting from just a little bit later, I think it is. Just a tiny bit later. It's around about the same time as Hieronymus Bosch, 1530. This is Judith. Judith, she's from the Book of Judith. In not all accept this as part of Scripture, but it's apocryphal to some shades of Christianity. The Book of Judith. Judith, and let's get the full picture to appreciate that look of anger. And this is the head of Holofernes. Okay, so in this story, Judith takes revenge. Holofernes is this tyrant. Okay, he's this tyrannical ruler, and he's done all sorts of terrible wrongs. And violence and so on, and we're on her side, no question of that in the Book of Judith. But the moment comes where he invites her, Judith, into his tent because he desires her. He has the sin of lust, if you like. And Judith, at this moment, lets out her righteous anger and decapitates Holofernes. I'm interested in this particular image, in that particular face, and in that particular depiction of anger. It's not something I can put into words, but I think you can see, especially when I show you some earlier pictures, this is an attempt to render that anger. This is an attempt, I think, and remember, we have nothing but sympathy in the Scripture. This is, after all, the book of Judith. She's on the side of right. She's avenging a tyrant. She's liberating a social order, bringing freedom and love and hope to a community. But look at that. Look. It's and the head too. It splits our feelings, doesn't it? It splits our feelings a little. has she gone too far? Is there something bubbling in her eyes which is just a little bit much? And in the face of the tyrant down there, is there just a tiny bit of compassion that we might feel as the eyes roll back in the head? Well, look, if we look at later images, we see that it's much simpler. And we don't get that being drawn into the scene and wondering, what's the line where revenge feels too good for it to be okay? What's the line where it's too violent to be okay? After all, cutting the head off of a tyrant, we would, all of us, I'm sure, think twice about what's right and what's wrong in that situation. I doubt any of you would say absolutely right every time, cut their heads off. And I doubt any of you would say absolutely wrong every time, don't in any situation attack the tyrant. I mean, it's complicated. Here it's not complicated, is it? Look at Judith. And also we might note that it was exquisite feminine anger in the last image, right? There was something particularly female. It was important. She was not being masculinized. Well, no, it would have. Other images do masculinize her, but she's not. She is woman who has done this, and it's important. But here, my God, what is Judith here? This is a 12th century ivory, so it's quite a small piece of work, if you imagine it's on a tusk. But still, I think it, and of course, you look, Holofernes here is asleep, and it's okay. It's not drawing our compassion for him. And she, well, I don't know what I feel when I see her face. I'm not sure. Mania? Indignation? Being a bit annoyed? I'm not sure that I see anger in it. Let's look at some other images. This is from the Getty Museum. This is from a manuscript from around about 1300, around about the same time as Dante. Nowhere near as sophisticated as Dante, is it? You see, once you start to probe these images, you see the problems. And of course, they're all in different contexts. The ivory is small. You might contemplate it. The 1530 portrait is large. It dominates a space. It's attractive. It will be somewhere prominent in a rich person's house. It's for guests to discuss. This is in a manuscript. This is only for people who already read Latin, who already have knowledge of God reading it. So maybe we don't need to do this emotional play. But still, there's very little emotion there, is there? I don't know what you think. Again, she's just serene. Maybe this image is even more so. This is stoic anger in action. This is maybe God's kind of anger, the anger which doesn't actually manifest itself as anger at all. I'm committing an act of vengeance, but I'm not going to enjoy it. I'm not going to let it step beyond the bounds. It's not going to be intoxicating. I'm going to pick up a sword, and I'm just going to casually slice off this head. And, because I know it's the right thing. I know it's the right action, but I'm not going to allow it to intoxicate my heart. I'm not going to allow it to, like black smoke, take hold of my chest and destroy me from the inside. Maybe this is the kind of anger we see here. Maybe that's going way too far. Maybe it's just a bad artist. I always struggle. With these questions. Other images, look, even a smile here. This is from, I think, a 12th century manuscript. I think it's German, that manuscript. Just a bit of a smile, more stoic anger. Here I see, notice again the blood dripping down, but no compassion for us. I feel much more compassion in this image. This is from a Book of Hours, a small book which would have been owned by probably a wealthy, usually women actually, who own these books. So it's not a surprise to see Judith, who's a good exemplar to all righteously angry women. Much more compassion there. Look at this pleading look. Do I have to hold it? And then... But you see much more the anger of duty. Again, this is my duty. So actually what you see from all of these other images is just how rare that exquisite pleasure in anger that we saw in that 1530 portrait, just how rare that is. Earlier medieval depictions were not going to grant you that psychological complexity. Is the anger okay? Is it too far? Am I drawn in? They're going to give you something along the spectrum of that. Ivory is much more like Lactantius' anger, whereas these are much more stoic, aren't they? Stoic Christian. On the topic of vengeance, I'm just going to introduce one more anecdote. I know it's difficult to follow sometimes. We just jump from here to here to here, but this one's quite a unique one, and it's actually quite important in 12th century history. It's quite important in English history. It's quite important in Christian history. It's a moment where an archbishop is decapitated at the request of a king, which does not happen as often as you would think. In fact, it's a really, really memorable moment. It's a memorable assassination. The short story is that King Henry II of England, he chose a man to be his archbishop who was already his friend. Basically, the idea was Henry would be the ruler of England, the highest power in the secular world, and his friend Thomas would become the most important person in the church. So between them, they would have the power sewn up. I think this is similar in actually Eastern Christianity. There's the story of the Mithropoet. Is he the Metropole? I forget the name. Anyway, there's a film Tsar about that, which explains. It's a very similar scenario, actually. Yes, Metropolitan. I knew I wouldn't get it right. So similar things there's parallels in other areas of Christian history. Anyway, Henry wants his best friend Thomas to be his right-hand man. They're going to rule the country together. They're going to sew everything up. Thomas then, and it's really weird, Thomas just starts saying no all the time. No. You want me to help? No, I'm not going to help. Thomas says no to everything the king wants. This is the short version. Henry starts to threaten Thomas. I need your help. You know, I'm in charge here, not you. Thomas shuts up a bit, and then Henry threatens him some more, gets really angry. Thomas goes into exile for 8 years, hides in France. They play a diplomatic war. Henry says, come back to England, all is forgiven. Thomas comes back to England, all wasn't forgiven. Thomas is executed in his own cathedral in 1170, just after Christmas. 4 knights knock on his door. Everyone in medieval circles knows the names of these 4 knights because it's so notorious. Or at least everyone who was living at the time knew their names. One of them's surname is Son of a Bear. It's quite important. Fitzurse. But anyway, so 4 knights knock on the door. Legend is they're drunk, have an argument. They kill the archbishop. The archbishop's dead on the floor. They get a sword out. They poke his brains about. He's definitely dead. The monks all come. They soak up all the blood. They sell it as a relic. You can go to Canterbury now and you can buy relics of St. Thomas. You can buy the T-shirt. It's still, it's still a pilgrimage site. The point of all this is, obviously, that was a moment of vengeful anger on the part of one individual, King Henry II. He took vengeance against someone who betrayed him. This is Canterbury Cathedral, of course. What I love is Henry justifies this in an interview. This guy, his confessor, has an interview with him, and he says, well, look, why should I not be angry when anger is a virtue of the soul and a power of nature? By nature, I am a son of anger. Henry's inventing his own philosophy here. This is not really, he's really justifying it himself. I don't know where he got these ideas. It actually would be an interesting paper. Anger is a virtue of the soul and a power of nature. Okay, so no longer Seneca. Remember, Seneca is against nature. Henry inventing his philosophy as a king, I suppose, is entitled to do. It's a virtue of nature, it's a power of nature, and he's a son of anger. Well, he said it, didn't he? That's what all his critics said. Now, obviously, this cuts 2 ways. Someone like Roger of Howden would say, Henry II is a just ruler, and his anger here is totally justified. And actually, this whole episode is kind of brushed. It's not brushed under the carpet. I think the thing is, everyone remembers it. And in practice, of course, Henry is condemned. What a murderer. He does penance, of course, like he gets on whatever. He gets on his hands and knees. He says he's sorry. He does all the performance of being sorry. He's not, damned for all eternity. He's let back into the church. But, and he makes his excuses. It wasn't done by me, it was done through me. This was his clever substitution. But for some, right, this was just, okay, it's justified. And what I mean by all that is, in future, what happened was other archbishops didn't risk going so far over the limits of what they thought would please the king. So in popular memory, it was like, maybe the king had a point at some level. Maybe Thomas was a little bit difficult. I'm not saying he deserved to have his brains on the floor, but maybe there was a sense in which he played the game wrong. So for some, maybe like Roger of Howden, there aren't many actually, it's justifiable. But as you see from the other quote, for some, this just confirms that Henry was the spawn of Satan. And there's this whole myth that Henry II was definitely 100% part of Satan's bloodline, and it could be proved. And all his children too. And part of that justification is his anger. It's obvious. He said it himself, he's a son of anger. This is Satan within him. Now, just to round up this whole vengeance question, let's go back to this sensible figure again of Thomas Aquinas to solve this problem. Was Henry the son of anger, son of Satan, or was he a just ruler? Or is Judith okay to enjoy her revenge, or is it going too far? Thomas Aquinas will tell us. And once again, we're going to have something similar to his idea about pride. And of course, he sits on the fence. But with Thomas, it's more like he builds the fence and then sits on it. It's much more, that's the way he does his reasoning. Revenge can be made for good or ill. Evil may be found in anger when, to wit, one is angry more or less than right reason demands. Oh, it's so familiar, isn't it? It's just like pride. But if one is angry in accordance with right reason, one's anger is deserving of praise. So once again, you reckon that we have this schema again for Thomas, over and over. There's justifiable anger. If your level of anger is reasonable, if it's less than reasonable, it's weak. If it's beyond reasonable, it's sinful rage. So again, of course, the big question is what is reasonable? What is proportionate? And this is much more like our contemporary view. Was it right for a king to do that? Well, in a court of law, of course, if it's something like manslaughter, this is exactly what's discussed. What level of reasonable force, what level of reasonable anger takes place, causes a crime. These sorts of discussions still take place. But I would like to draw your attention to the fact that there is an unacceptably low level of anger for St. Thomas. It is possible to not be angry enough. This recalls Lactantius. If you have no anger, you can't be kind. I think that, yes, that is Lactantius. I think Thomas here is on the same wavelength. In the time that remains, let's just step into the world of the contemporary then. Because if we say that in a modern court of law, anger could be a topic of discussion, and the tacit assumption of what is pathological and what is not is we would think about things like an emotional outburst. We would think about things like, well, actually, intoxicants. Somebody was drunk and they just had a terrible blow in their lives. They just had an emotional situation. They've been fired. They're going through a divorce and they do something. This, in a modern court of law, would be taken into account in a discussion of culpability, wouldn't it? You can imagine. There's a lesser degree of culpability if something is seen as part of a justifiable circle of anger. And likewise, if something isn't, we might render it more pathological. It just came from nowhere. Of course, it's much more pathological. Let's look at the hard sciences, insofar as I'm able to. Let's look at what some of the hard sciences say. And it's interesting because I wonder if it can help to loosen us from our faith in the view that these things are fixed. Let's have a look. And this, I'm not expecting us all to read all of this. And of course, I haven't put what the abbreviations mean. And I don't know what most of the abbreviations mean, so it's okay. I just want to draw your attention to a couple of things. This is from a recent, and it's a fantastic multidisciplinary handbook of anger, actually, but mostly from the sciences. There's some small history of anger in there. It's recently published. This is an article by Michael Reuter, Population and Molecular Genetics of Anger and Aggression. It's the current state of the art. Again, look, I can't pass this whole thing for you, but the point is that they're studying anger and patterns of angry behavior, patterns of angry temperament in terms of genetics and looking for patterns. And I see this as, well, it's just fascinating in itself. For example, I just notice here, look at right up here, state anger, trait anger, and angry temperament. In this study from 2002 of healthy volunteers and suicide attempters, this angry temperament is associated with the A allele in both samples. So just at the basic level, there's some association modern scientists want to make between an angry temperament and some genetic value, some aspect of your DNA, some aspect of how you are written as a human. Now, I think there are a few, there are others in here, of course, as you can see. Even suicide attempts here in this study, the A allele occurred with greater frequency in the patients who had attempted suicide. History of either assaultive or threatening behavior, C allele in males. There are levels of complexity to this genetic material. And I have to say, I'm, of course, not qualified to understand this fully. But what I can understand is that it's another way of rendering the pathology of anger, isn't it? It's another way of showing it, of framing it. And I wonder what it does to the sense that someone's too angry. What happens when you say, well, yes, of course, I have an angry temperament. I was too angry, but this is because I have an allele pattern in my genetics. This is who I am. It actually depathologizes anger. It takes it away from the moral framework. If we're going to discuss why you're angry, what you're doing in your anger, how you can stop it, our discussions, if we entirely encounter anger on a moral territory, if this is your choice, this is how you respond to situations, then of course we discuss all kinds of things about who you are, your upbringing, how you respond to situations, your the plasticity, if you like, of your relationships with other people, whether you could change it or not. How you are in your being, in your social life. But if we discuss it on the terrain of this, is there even a pathology in terms of your social or moral behaviour? Arguably not. This renders it as just a simple matter of genetics. Your anger, you're too angry. Well, of course you are. You have the C allele. You're a man. So just something to flag up. This is a language. Now, of course, this presents itself as being absolute in a way. That's always the danger, I think, sometimes with this scientific framing. It presents itself as it is. It's value-free. Of course, what it doesn't tell us is all kinds of complex relative factors. All right, there's this genetic association, but of course there are other factors, aren't there? There are psychological factors. We know from our own lives, it cannot just be that there was something on a twist of fabric in my biological matter that meant that I got angry when you shut my hand in the door more than I would normally. That it's because you've been stressed recently. You've been up making PowerPoints till 3 a.m. There are things in your life that have been causing these problems. And in other words, the danger is to see something as simple when it's actually a complex thing. And it's just something to flag up with this. But nevertheless, it's fascinating, isn't it? In terms of the deadly sins. Makes me think that it's not so sinful at all to be angry. The neuroscience, neurology, and so on. This is another article from the same handbook, Michael Portugal and Gerhard Stemmler. Look, I'm the first to say I do not know what this stuff means. I do not know that it's significant that one part of the brain is active when another isn't. I don't think, and I think we would have to talk to Krishna, who does know, and that would be interesting, to ask him about anger in terms of the brain, or any of the sins in terms of the brain. I feel like, as a layman, I feel that we're not at a stage where this stuff we can really make specific comments about what this means. But what I did see when I looked at the literature is that there's very little activity in the amygdala when people are angry, according to brain activity. And the amygdala is where we have fear, like the most base responses. Apparently it's the oldest part of the brain. So like I see a snake, the amygdala goes really high. But apparently anger not connected to the same part of the brain. I don't know what this means. Again, we'll have to ask Krishna. But of course, it's another way of rendering. I could say, well, this is anger here. What does it tell us? I'm much more interested in this kind of pathologization of anger, this kind of schema. And this is from the language or the models of psychologists and social psychologists. This is an article, again, from Iman Asghari. And this shows the maladaptive schemas. There's certain kinds of things that can go wrong in your upbringing or your lives that can tend towards angry behavior, and look at them. And it's fascinating. And, disconnection and rejection, emotional deprivation, abandonment, instability, mistrust, abuse, defectiveness, shame, social isolation, impaired autonomy and performance, impaired limits, other-directedness, over-vigilance, and inhibition. I'm not going to dispute any of this. I think it's fascinating. I think it's a commendably complex picture of how a mind can descend into anger or ascend into anger. The only thing I would point out is, we ask this question all the time, how is it being framed as something wrong? Where is that framing happening? You see up there, disconnection and rejection, the assumption that the healthy human is connected, okay? The healthy human feels valued. Impaired autonomy and performance, the healthy human performs in some way. What is this? I miss, at this time, someone like John Tangney, who used to be here, who would constantly remind us that we shouldn't always expect people to perform and be happy, that happiness itself was this oppressive system. But anyway, other directedness, so you should be directed. Over-vigilance and inhibition should not be inhibited. There's a series, in other words, of norms behind this kind of system. Norms about what a human should be, which you would make interesting comparisons with medieval norms about what a human should be and should do in a healthy society. Are you still with me? We're almost over for this half of the show. It's the last bit now. Any questions or comments? We have a microphone. Any questions or comments at this stage? Or have any of you experienced any other languages of anger in the contemporary, in our lives, you know? Anyone want to contribute anything? I didn't talk about the practice of therapy or CBT, but of course there's a whole language about how to overcome anger in therapy. Anyone want to say anything? And I think we have a microphone. Yeah. Okay. It works. Have faith.
How it was impossible to make a sin something that belongs to God? Well, as we know from the beginning of the presentation and from the Old Testament and sometimes, I guess, in the New Testament, God may become angry, and he becomes angry sometimes, time to time. How it even became possible to make anger a sin?
Well, yeah, this is the paradox, isn't it? How is it possible? Well, look, on the one hand, you can deny that God was angry, and you can say, well, anger is still a sin, it's still unreasonable. And you can say, when God is described as being angry in the Old Testament, this is metaphorical. This is meant to be understood anagogically, spiritually. It's not real anger. It's not one person losing control of their passions.
He killed nearly all the people in times of great flood.
Yes. There are, needless to say, theologians love this kind of problem and saying, well, yes, it looks like anger, but, you know, really it's something more serene. It's the unfolding of a divine plan. I don't know. But anyway, the point is that there are ways of reading God's anger in the Old Testament and neutralizing it and suggesting that it's simply, it's not someone. The point is not to see it as a person being overcome by their emotions, but as someone who is beyond our understanding, all-knowing, who is doing something, which we only interpret as anger. So that's one way to answer the question, but I totally get your point. Any other questions or comments? Should we do the history of the emotions? Oh yeah, okay, Nikita.
Yeah, actually, I would like to answer your question a little bit, probably. I guess it's the same situation as with Crusades. Like, it's again the holy, the divine anger, as and we can explain the actions of God in the same way. Like, it was like a divine anger, and the people who participated in Crusades, they also killed Muslims just because they conquered the city of Jerusalem, and the Christians want to take it back. And it's kind of not really rational for us to kill people because they just in some land, we have a lot of lands in the world, and the same situation with the Great Flood, what was the point? But still, if it's possible to explain it in some way, in some divine nature or something like that, it's easier to explain to explain it to yourself and to other people, probably, why some anger is possible and some is not.
Yeah, I think the basic principle there is not to judge God by your own standards or the standards of human community. This would be the first theological trick. But then it's hard not to, isn't it? It's hard not to humanize God and make him into a sort of person who does things for human reasons.
Yeah.
Yes. But we should move on, I realise.
It's what we discussed during the seminar today. Like,
Precisely.
We cannot judge God by our own standards because he is not a human being, and like everything which we can imagine and we can act, it's not the same for God. God is beyond this dilemmas and so on for theological debates probably.
Okay, the history of the emotions. I'll just do this really quickly. I'm just going to introduce the basic framework of this. And the reason is because anger has become a real topic of discussion among historians in the last 20 years in this subfield of the history of the emotions. There's a book called Anger's Past, for example, edited volume by Barbara Rosenwein. There's a book this year, Yale University Press, again by Rosenwein, on anger, and we'll look at that in a second. There are kind of two basic approaches, very, very basic approaches, and it's kind of silly in a way because everyone falls on one side, so it's kind of silly, but two basic approaches to do emotions have a history. One of them is biological determinism, which is quite simply, no, they do not. It's the same emotions, guys, just different humans having the same emotions forever and ever and ever and ever. 150,000 years of this human form, 150,000 years of the same feeling of anger when someone shuts your finger in a door. Okay, so that's one, even before there were doors. That's one. On the other hand, we have social constructivism. And there's weak and strong. At the strong end of social constructivism is the idea that basically all emotional feeling is shaped by the circumstances, by the world of language, the world of cultural forms, the world of expectations, right? So the way you feel your anger can be shaped and manipulated, right? You know, if you live in a society where anger is a good thing and it's constantly like valorized, people say, you know, fantastic, another great story of another angry person who did well. Arguably, in the strong social constructivism, this makes you experience your anger differently. You frame it differently, you experience it differently. And of course, this goes for the other emotions too, lust and, you know, is that an emotion? Love, the passions, joy and others. At the weaker end of the spectrum, which I think is where most people really occupy, is respecting the fact the emotions stay the same, the actual physical feelings, but the way they're articulated do change how people perceive them. So if you're angry, I perceive it differently. And I think that this one chimes with anyone who's gone overseas much in their lives, has travelled abroad. You see that there are different norms and standards. You know, sometimes anger is, you know, quick. People get angry really quickly, and you know, in some places, because there's a certain expectation that it's okay to do that in certain situations. I just think of just one, like people hitting the horn, drivers shouting. Remember, I lived in Toronto. I've never seen such angry people. No, I mean, only in their cars. Wonderful people outside of their cars. In their cars, extremely angry people. There was maybe that was a part of a socially constructivist expectation of what you should do on the road and how you receive it. Anyway, there are kind of, just to quote a couple of historians about this, there are these concepts like emotional communities, you know, the groups in which people adhere to the same norms of emotional expression. You could say that Toronto has an emotional community around anger among drivers. That's an emotional community, right? That you know, because of course you can belong to lots of them. So there's also the emotional community of the office in England, where if you raise your voice, it's really bad news. You know, that's the emotional community there. It might be very different in a Russian office. I'm not sure. And then William Reddy has emotives. Every community deploys emotional ideals and norms, indicates norms through emotional rituals, formulas, prayers, so on. Communities have a huge stake in how people habitually use emotives. Just alerting ourselves to the fact that these happen in language. There are certain words we use, and these frame our expectations. Just for fun, because the last part of a long lecture, let's just look a little bit at the emotional communities and the things that shape the way people understand anger in the Middle Ages. Yes, I mean, this body, my goodness. And he's really getting on okay, considering all these things that are happening to him. The body in the Middle Ages is a topic for another class, but there are certain ways of understanding how that body works that I think are really important for understanding how anger is received, understood, appreciated, or not. And let's begin, shall we, with the humour theory. And this is important. And this is actually one that comes from Galen. It comes from an ancient text, which, it's like the oldest medical text of them all. And it just circulates through all these different cultures and societies in Western history and Arabic history too. The idea that the body has 4 humours, and that the balance of these different humours, these liquids and substances in the body, the balance relative to each other dictates your behaviour and your temperament. So if you remember from modern hard sciences, if you're an angry temperament, it's because there's some specificity of your A allele in your genetics. The medieval version of that is, if you have an angry temperament, you have too much yellow bile in your body, or you have a balance towards yellow bile. You are a choleric personality. As you can see, this comes from the gallbladder, this yellow bile. What is yellow bile? I think there is such a thing as yellow bile. Again, I'm not sure. I've never been inside a body, looked inside a body. The element that this is associated with is fire. You remember that in the Aristotelian idea that there are 4 elements. It's a lovely medieval trick to always, and also ancient trick, to just map these things on. If there's 4 elements, 4 liquids in the body, they can't resist putting them together. So this is fire. And as you can see, the choleric mentality, too much yellow bile, you're bitter, you're short-tempered, you're daring, you appear greenish or yellow in your skin. So now you know. Anyone who's got a greenish tinge to their skin this morning, they're a choleric individual. Black bile is associated with melancholy. You sometimes see that in literature. He had too much black bile. Lazy, fearful, and sickly appear with black eyes. It's none of us. Blood is associated with sanguinity. This is the only good one, really. Full of blood. Too much blood? Well, it's not so bad. You're friendly, you joke, you laugh. You have a red-tinted, good skin. And then phlegm. Phlegm is not the same thing that people should not spit on the street, especially in a viral time. Phlegm is apparently this sort of brain-lung fluid, vaguely defined, low-spirited and forgetful. I think this is me. So there we are. So on the one hand, the simple thing to say is, right, okay, there's a certain understanding of the body which frames anger in this way. So, short-tempered, well, there's a way that can actually not make this a pathology of sin, of morality. There is a language that exists for saying, well, this is just part of the body, I'm afraid. Dimitri's always getting upset, but it's understandable because, he's got too much yellow bile. It's easy. We don't have to start saying, well, actually, because I think he had pride first and then envy, and he's let his soul corrupt. No, there's another language which we can use. Too much yellow bile. There is another language. What's this, guys? Any guesses? What could it be? What could the other language be? One of those games where you do that, is that what you're saying?
Looks like that.
Close. It's close enough. Any ideas? It's pretty mysterious, isn't it? This is, of course, a horoscope. This is a horoscope. This is someone's astrological reading. Where were the planets when you were born? It's not that far off from this. Where were the planets when you were born? Jupiter was was rising, and I don't know how it works. My father used to do it, actually. He used to know all of the planets, or at least pretended he did. For fun, I think. So Mars is the planet associated with aggression and war. And if you have a horoscope in the Middle Ages, which people did, it's kind of an alternative to the whole Christian moral discourse, then you can be told that, the reason is, it's not even the yellow bile, Dimitri, it's just that you were born when Mars was right there. And that's the reason. You're not actually angry, I'm sorry, I shouldn't pick on you. Mars, as you say, as this is Al-Kabasi, this is from the 900s. This is an Arabic astrological text which was translated into Latin, as you can see, in the 12th century. Mars indicates tyranny, bloodshed, conquering, highway robbery, wrongful seizure, the leadership of armies, etc. The management of riding animals, other things, interesting. All of them wicked practices. And you can see this from depictions of Mars in medieval manuscripts, often personified. So this is not to be underestimated. And I suppose the reason I'm sort of ending with this is, as a reminder, it's always a more complicated story than we think. So I spent most of the lecture talking about, the conflict of when is anger right or wrong, when does it go beyond, when is it sinful. Just to remember, there is like a release valve, another language, like we use other languages for describing behavior and for pathologizing it or for making it okay, don't we? We do. Like there's the language of the law. There is the language of, you know, your stress levels, your hormone levels, all other kinds of scientific languages that we use. There's also stuff more deep, psychological things. You know, well, you know, I think actually this is a traumatized subject. My aunt is traumatized. I understand why she gets so angry. We use all kinds of different languages to explain these things. The Middle Ages is the same at some level. Respecting that complexity should always be our mission when we encounter a medieval text. After all, if we're seeing a text that's really layered with all this discussion of the planets, then it might just be that rather than framing it as a sin, they're framing it as an accident of birth. So guys, I'm leaving you with 3 questions. And these questions are here just for your reflection, okay? We're not going to discuss them now. In the medieval experience of anger, how did philosophical ideas or moral assumptions connect with hardwired biological facts? In the medieval experience, if you were writing, if you really had to decode one moment of anger in medieval texts or in the medieval experience, like, how would you connect their whole philosophical system, Aristotle, Seneca, and others, moral assumptions, the whole, you know, literature of what is a sin, what is not a sin? How would you connect it with hardwired biological facts? Those are, on the one hand, the biological facts that we know about. We know what anger looks like. We know how it works. We connect it with trauma in our modern sciences and other things, genetics and so on. How can we connect these things? Is it impossible to do so? What is the difference between a medieval sin and a modern social psychological pathology? Is there really a difference? Someone, you know, is it the same stuff, the same judgment, just different language? Like, I'm upset, or like, we judge you badly for being angry and for enjoying it. And I would have done the same in the year 1100 or the year 2020. The difference is that I'm going to use different language to describe why I'm upset. Is that what we're seeing? Or have people really changed? You know, are there real changes? Like revenge in the time of Titus Andronicus, when you see men being made into a pie, do the audience cheer and say, that's what good anger looks like? And do we watch it now and think that's disgusting? Or actually, do you think there's a continuum where it's pretty similar, just different language for describing that disgust? And do we currently function with different emotional communities of anger? What are our emotives? I mentioned Toronto drivers and, you know, so on. Maybe just think about that. And I'm just going to leave you with that last image and the question of the question that actually comes to us often of how we feel about other people's anger, and when we feel we should be swept up in it, and when we feel we should not, when we feel that rage is right, and when we feel that it's destructive. Okay, guys, I'll see you for the second part in just let's see, in